So, Lone Rider here, and I said after I got a chance to use this thing at the fencing club that I would be doing a review of the VB Purple Heart Armory feather sword. This is the traditional training weapon for the longsword. You usually have either one of these or a blunt longsword. This has an advantage over the blunt longsword in that it's got a narrower blade, so theoretically it hits less hard. You usually have a rolled or spatula tip. This one's a rolled tip. And you have a shield or wide ricasso here. The normal advantage of that is twofold. It keeps blades that are coming down away from your hand a little further away than the crossguard by itself would. So you don't get struck in the back, maybe break a finger. Another thing is a lot of the false edge cuts, I got to watch the walls and ceiling here, but a lot of the false edge cuts involve having your thumb under the blade and pivoting around that. And the thing is that the blade itself is narrower than a normal sword, so if you see, that's not much wider than my thumb. If I have large protective gloves on, my thumb's going to be even bigger, and basically it's going to stick out on either side and be vulnerable. Having the wider shield down here, it basically makes the base of the blade where it meets the crossguard, where you would normally put your thumb, essentially as wide as a normal sword blade, while keeping the rest of it narrower so that it doesn't hit as hard. So, you have the advantage of it protects you from blows coming down like this, so they aren't as likely to hit your hand here, and it also provides you a place to put your thumb that's a little wider and protected that way. Now this particular one is available from Purple Heart Armoury. If you go to woodenswords.com, that's their website. It's made by a Czech smith. His initials are VB, Victor. I'm not going to try and pronounce his last name. It would be discourteous. But if you go to their website, you can find it. They make several versions. There's a basic version. There's this, which is the stiff version. And then there's the version C, which is a little more flexible and a little bit lighter. Then there's also another version that has side rings on the hilt. Somebody at the local fencing club actually has one of those. And it's one of the reasons I chose this. I was able to handle the one that he had in person and examine it, and it kind of helped me decide. I said, okay, I've gotten to check that out in person, so, it's a little easier to order something from, a website when you've actually been able to try it out. And I said I would do a review on this when I got to use it more often in fencing class, that it wouldn't be fair to review it after only using it one time. So I've had the chance to use it several times since at the local fencing club, and it's held up excellently. This is a slightly thicker and wider blade than some other swords, and I think that that has contributed to the durability. There are several scratches on the blade, but there's no edge damage to speak of. If you look at the edge, you won't see any major nicks or dings. There literally are a handful of scratches, and that's it. This fetter has gone up against Regagniers, an Ensifer, several Albions, Castile Armoury, and a handful of other swords. And it's emerged unscathed. Pretty damn cool, if you ask me. Especially since this costs about $100 less than the nearest competition, which would be the standard Regagnier fetter. Now, the construction. This thing is made out of a single piece of carbon steel. It has a rolled tip, as you can see there. Fairly thick blade, a little bit wider down here, especially than some others. But it is fairly flexible. You have a shield. You have a wide crossguard. Then you have the grip. The grip itself is a leather core stitched up the back. I should say wood core covered with leather stitched up the back. Slips on, fits into this little ferrule which is attached to the guard, and then there's a little recess in the end of the pommel that the other end fits into, and then the pommel goes on. And then you have a little nut that goes in there. I think it's a 14 millimeter Allen nut. I have to check. But so the way this works is the pommel threads on and tightens down, and then that nut goes in there, and then that tightens down. And the idea is the nut is like a lock nut. It keeps the pommel from getting too loose, from unscrewing. And so far, this thing has been solid. I had to tighten it very slightly after my first time using it at class. And since then, I've used it several times, like I said, against many other swords, and I haven't had a problem. And the first time when I tightened it, it wasn't that anything was rattling or visibly loose. I just happened to be holding the handle and go like this, and happened to notice that it moved a fraction of an inch. Literally, that's as much as it moved, like that. But then afterwards, I noticed that since I was able to tighten it slightly, I then took out my Allen key and tightened the nut down, and then it hasn't moved since. This thing has been rock solid and excellent. And like I said, no edge damage to speak of, even going up against swords that cost 2 or 3 times as much. Nobody's been hurt by it. It's it is a little heavier and it is a little stiffer, but it's certainly within the norm for practice drills and even sparring. Would I use this in a tournament? I don't know. Purple Heart Armory's website says not advised for tournaments, but I've never been in a tournament. Some people from my local fencing club have. I'm a noob, so I'm going to stay shy of tournaments for a while. I would prefer to live a little longer. What was interesting, though, is I did use this last week, or this past week, I should say, at the fencing club. I went 3 rounds with one of the other students who was an advanced student. And he had an Albion, and I had this thing. And there were 3 exchanges before he was able to. He had a blow that came and whacked me behind the head, and boom, that's all she wrote. I will point out, by the way, this is why you should have back of the head protection on your fencing mask if you do longsword. A lot of the blows, especially if somebody's going to do a false edge cut, sometimes they do end up wrapping around. Yeah, it was a near thing. I should have had back of the head protection. But anyway, no harm done, no hard feelings. He was fighting to win, and so was I, and he just happened to know more about what he was doing, being as I'm a noob. But the point is that the thing held up fine to his sword. He was using an Albion, which is a lot lighter and a little more balanced, and probably has harder steel, and yet this didn't take any serious damage, and I was able to hold my own despite my lack of skill for 3 exchanges. So I thought that was pretty cool. Now here's the thing. How does it handle? Well, it's a budget sword. So it's a little bit heavier than other swords. It's slightly heavier than a Reginier. It's definitely heavier than an Albion. It's not that much heavier than a Castile Armoury, but it does balance differently than all of these. Most Federschwurz balance at the end of the Schilt or flayed ricasso. So about there, or even slightly before. This balances just past the shed ricasso, about 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches past. That's due to the fact that it has a thicker, slightly wider blade down here. However, that also, I think, has to do with the fact that it hasn't sustained any edge damage, and then it's held up remarkably well. So, you have a sword that's slightly heavier, but actually feels a little bit heavier than it is because of how it balances. Is that a bad thing? Yes and no. I mean, if you were looking at, I want the best handling sword ever that's going to be really light and nimble and yada yada, this isn't for you. But if you're looking for a budget sword for doing longsword that'll get you started, and that's overbuilt enough that it'll be able to compete with heavier swords without taking damage, and therefore last a long time, this is definitely something for you. That said, again, they do make several versions. They make a ring-heeled version. They make a version that's a little bit more flexible. This is the so-called stiff version, or earlier version, version B. But I was very pleased with this for what it is. It's not supposed to handle like an Albion. It's not supposed to handle like a sword that costs $100 more, but it's built so that it can go up against swords that cost $100 more and not get dinged up too bad. And that's exactly what it does. And it is light enough you can use it in one hand. Again, I have to watch the ceiling. Would it be tiresome to do so? Yeah, I mean, except for grappling techniques, a lot of longswords aren't supposed to be used in one hand. They're two-handed swords. You can use them in one hand if you have to, but they're ideally more suited for two-handed use. However, it is light enough you could use it with one hand if you had to. That said, in two hands is where it shines. This is, like I said, it's slightly heavier than some other swords that cost $100 or more. And it maybe feels a little heavier than it is because it balances a little further out because of the way the weight there is distributed. But that said, this is a solid, I would say 8 out of 10 in my book. Right? I haven't had a single problem with it. It hasn't taken a single major nick in the blade. It hasn't hurt anybody. It's done what I needed to do to, safeguard myself and fence with the other person. And it's fun to use, right? And that's what it's all about. I mean, why do it if it's not fun? Would it be nice to have a more expensive sword? Yeah. But if you're in the market for a budget fetter to try longsword, to get started in this sort of thing, I can wholeheartedly recommend the VB fetters from Purple Heart Armoury. They're maybe a little overbuilt, but all that means is they're just going to last really long and hold up really good. I think they're onto something with the way the pommel and the lock nut works. One of the guys, actually one of the instructors at the fencing club, has a Castile Armoury fetter, one of the older models. And his pommel just screws on. There's no lock nut or anything. I remember he loaned me his Castile Armoury for a couple lessons that I was using it. And after the lesson, I had to just tighten the pommel by hand. Like I said, except for one time where I had to slightly move it like a teeny tiny fraction of a turn and then tighten the nut. I've taken this to 3 lessons. I had to tighten it that one time and that was it. The last 2 and 2.5, no issue. No, nothing. It's rock solid. It's well built. Good quality steel. And no corrosion either. And I haven't bothered to oil this. I've just, made sure to, wipe it off after I've used it to get any fingerprints off the steel. But I haven't oiled it or anything. And, no corrosion. No, nothing. So this is held up excellently. Again, the balance is, it's a little heavier. It's not as light as some swords, but it's really solid. It's well made. I think they made some good design choices with how they attached the pommel, with the lock nut to keep it from coming loose. And overall, the design and the aesthetic is really good. Some people might, nitpick this stitching up the side. I don't have a problem with that. And the fact that a training sword doesn't have to be pretty, but I do like the simple aesthetic, especially when it comes to medieval swords. Something like a longsword or a fetter, which is the historical training analog for a longsword. I mean, this is what they used back in medieval times, too. And this simple crossguard that just flares a little bit at the ends. This simple pommel with the 2 grooves there going around it, which they didn't have to put there, but they put there. It gives it sort of almost an Art Deco-ish look. I mean, this is a handsome sword, and it's $100 less than the nearest competitor. Yeah, it's a little heavier. Yeah, it's a little more overbuilt, maybe a little chunky, but it handles just as good once you get the hang of it. And you can't touch anything like this. Like I said, the nearest sword in cost is going to be about $100. And I'm going to be honest, this was a early Christmas gift for me. I couldn't have afforded this at the time. So Yeah, if you want to get into longsword, if you want to give it a try, um, you know, what do I think of the Purple Heart Armory feathers? I think you should definitely give them a shot. I think they're pretty damn cool. Um, this sort of thing, it's it's a great budget option. It's a great entry level sword for what it's supposed to be. I I can't praise it enough. Um, I have what I would regard as fairly high expectations. Maybe 8 out of 10, maybe closer to 9. I don't know, but it's a damn good sword for the money, and even at a little bit, even if it costs a little more than it did, it'd still be a damn good sword. So there you go. That said, do I recommend this model? It depends on what you want. I mean, I happened to get this one because it was a little cheaper. Um, you might want to get the one that's slightly more flexible if you intend on ever seeing, the inside of a tournament. As like I said, they said this one is not recommended for tournaments. Presumably, it would hit harder at full speed, but it's certainly substantially flexible. I haven't had a problem with it at the club. And like I said, I've used it against just about every other sword there is, from Albion to Castile Armoury to Enzifer to, you name it, and this thing has held up fine. So, yeah, I would highly recommend you check one of these out. Like I said, they have different models. You could get the one that's a little more flexible. You could get this. You could get the one with the ring hilt. But the smith who makes them does an excellent job. Purple Heart Armory has great customer service. And the sword itself, what do I think of it? I'm really happy. It's a nice looking sword. It's solidly built. And it handles decently enough, especially for a budget sword. So there you go, Lone Rider. My review of the VB Fetter from Purple Heart Armory, version B. And get yourself one of these or one of the other models that they make. It's a great budget sword to get into longsword. And, like I said, the next nearest thing in price, you're looking at $100 jump in price. So, for considering it's $100 less than a Reginier, what do I think of this? I am very happy with it, and I think you would be too. Lone Rider out.